What began as an innocent royal gathering ended in quiet or break. Prince George, just a child, noticed something others missed. Prince Louis had been quietly pulled away, separated under the watch of a trusted aide tied to Queen Camilla's circle. George followed, sensed the danger, and then in front of stunned staff broke down in tears. Not from fear, but from knowing something was deeply wrong. His instincts kicked in, his courage followed what George uncovered would rock the palace, expose a secret power play, and force William and Kate into full protection mode. This wasn't just emotion, it was a royal warning. The moment Prince George broke in tears. It was supposed to be a casual private royal gathering, nothing formal, nothing political. But something didn't sit right with Prince George. The garden was filled with laughter, distant chatter, and the gentle clinking of teacups. Staff were relaxed, but George noticed one detail no one else caught. Prince Louis was missing. Moments earlier he had been playing near the fountain, now he was gone. George's instincts kicked in immediately. He scanned the gathering discreetly, his young face tense. Then quietly, he followed the path toward the west garden, Archer Place, usually off limits to unaccompanied children. There he spotted something that would stay with him forever. Louis stood alone, nervously fidgeting with his sleeves. Nearby, one of Queen Camilla's senior aides stood watching him, not cruel, not overtly threatening, but strangely authoritative. The others were nowhere in sight. No games, no snacks, no laughter. Judge the silence. George didn't wait. He rushed over, grabbed his brother's hand and whispered, "Let's go." Louis didn't argue. He looked relieved. But as they returned to the main garden, George suddenly stopped. He turned toward his mother, eyes welling up with tears. It was too much, the confusion, the fear, the weight of what he had just sensed, and in front of several startled staffers, Prince George, stoic, mature, and always composed, broke down crying. He wasn't crying out of fear for himself. He was crying because he thought he was about to lose his brother. And in that moment the palace began to feel the first ripple of something much bigger. A strange invitation, or raises red flags. The day had started with what seemed like a kind gesture. A handwritten note from Queen Camilla. His team arrived at Kensington Palace, inviting Prince Louis to a special children's afternoon gathering, tea games, storytelling, and one-on-one time with senior royal figures. It sounded innocent, sweet, even, but one detail stood out immediately. Only Louis was invited, not George, not Charlotte, just Louis. Kate, swamped with back-to-back engagements, hadn't seen the invitation until after it had been accepted by a junior aide. William, trusting routine, didn't question it. The palace machine was always moving. Sometimes things slipped through. George noticed when he found out he wasn't allowed to go. He didn't protest the way a jealous sibling might. He went quiet, watchful, observant, and when he saw who was escorting Louis, a staffer linked closely to Camilla's private team, his concern deepened. Insiders say George lingered around the door, waiting longer than usual. When he was told he couldn't join, he didn't argue, he simply walked away. But he never stopped paying attention. Later that day, George followed the staff's route, and when he found Louis standing alone, separated from the other children, something clicked. The event wasn't just a tea party, it was intentional, and for George that changed everything. George begins to sense a trap. In the days that followed, George's behavior changed, not in tantrums or defiance, but in quiet vigilance. He began watching over Louis more closely, staying by his side during family engagements, even skipping activities he normally enjoyed just to keep track of his younger brother. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just a big brother anymore. He felt like a guardian. One moment stood out. During a palace event, George overheard a senior staffer mention something about special royal lessons. Louis had been invited to. The comment was offhand, but it froze George in his tracks. "Why isn't Louis with us?" he asked sharply. The staffer brushed it off, but George didn't forget it. From that point forward, George shadowed Louis whenever possible. He'd sit near him during mealtime, hold his hand during public appearances, quiet, constant presence. He even began questioning staff when things seemed different. At such a young age, George had developed a sense of danger, not in a theatrical way, but in a deep intuitive one. He had grown up in the royal bubble, seen what stress did to his parents, and lived through years of palace politics most children never imagined. And now, without fully understanding why, he could tell Louis was being targeted, not harmed, not punished, but positioned. Whispers around the palace described Camilla's growing interest in mentoring the youngest royals. She had always been strategic, charming when it suited her, generous in private, especially with those who would shape the future. But George saw through it, and it wasn't kindness that scared him, it was intent. Camilla's quiet influence behind the scenes. What once looked like harmless affection soon began to raise deeper concerns. Queen Camilla had always maintained a grandmotherly presence around the younger royals, often offering sweet smiles and warm stories about the past, but behind those gestures something else was quietly building, a pattern of influence that became harder to ignore. Insiders started to connect dots. Louis was often invited alone. Camilla would pull him aside during gatherings for one-on-one chats. She gifted him books, asked about his thoughts on being a prince, and allegedly spoke about what real loyalty looks like within the firm. It wasn't the actions themselves that alarmed royal aides. It was the subtle undertone of messaging. "Your brother is busy, or you and I understand each other," she was once overheard saying in a low voice. Another time, a palace source claimed she told Louis, "Not everyone in this family plays fair, but you're a good one." To a child, those might sound like compliments, but to those watching closely, they felt like seeds being planted. The turning point came when a junior staffer new to the royal wrote her raised a quiet concern. He had noticed Louis being coached through royal protocol during what was supposed to be a simple story hour with Camilla. It felt rehearsed, he said, like they were preparing him for something. Senior aides began reviewing past visits and found that several sessions had been arranged by Camilla as private secretary, bypassing the usual family schedule. These weren't grandmotherly bonding moments, they were coordinated, intentional, and increasingly one-sided. For William and Kate, it was a clear red flag. But before they could act, it was George's quiet alarm that made them look harder. Kate learned the truth from George. It was late in the evening when George finally spoke. Kate was reading to Charlotte while Louis colored on the floor. George sat nearby, silent, but his eyes weren't on the book. He was staring out the window. Distant, tense. And then softly, he said it. "They're taking Louis away again." At first Kate didn't understand. "What do you mean?" she asked. George hesitated, then explained everything. The invitations, the isolation, the strange staff, the day he cried in the garden. His voice cracked only once when he said, "They don't want him with us." Its stomach dropped. She immediately called for the weekly staff logs. Her assistant handed her the documents, printed, time-stamped, routine. But when she cross-referenced them with her own calendar, one thing became horrifyingly clear. Several events involving Louis had been scheduled without her or William's approval. One in particular stood out: a garden mentorship session arranged directly by Camilla's senior aide. Kate didn't waste time. She requested an urgent call with the head of staff, demanding a list of everyone involved. Within hours, Louis, his name was removed from all solo events. Any appearance coordinated by Camilla, his office would now require Kate's direct sign-off, no exceptions. She then set George down and reassured him the way only a mother can. "I know what you saw," she said gently, "and I'm proud of you for speaking up." From that moment on, Louis was never again invited without his siblings, and behind the scenes a quiet storm was beginning to form. A pattern emerges around Camilla as the situation unraveled. It became clear this wasn't an isolated case. Royal aides began looking into past interactions Camilla had initiated with other young royals, and the findings raised even more eyebrows. Similar mentoring gestures had been reported in previous years involving Archie Mountbatten Windsor and even August Brooksbank. At the time they had seen and innocent small gifts, offhand advice, private chats, but in retrospect they fit the same pattern: access, messaging, separation. Camilla often framed these moments as maternal, but internally staff started using a different word: positioning. Her presence wasn't just about bonding, it was about influence, and over time it became clear that her attention wasn't evenly spread. Charlotte, for example, had been notably excluded from these gatherings. Aides couldn't recall a single solo invitation involving her. That details struck a chord. If this was about kindness, why the selective nurse, and why, according to more than one source, had Camilla referred to Louis as the one with the clearest heart during a private meeting? For some the line felt sweet, but for others it was chilling. Was Louis being groomed as the more malleable heir? George's emotional reaction had pierced through the palace's complacency. It forced a spotlight onto Camilla's subtle tactics, not because she had broken rules, but because she had quietly blurred them. She had used access, she had built rapport, but most dangerously she had done it out of sight. Now, with Kate's intervention and George's bravery combined, the curtain had been pulled back, and suddenly the whispers about Camilla, his intentions, weren't whispers anymore. They were warnings. Why? George's tears changed everything. In the royal world, tears are rarely seen, especially from heirs. Prince George had always carried himself with quiet strength far beyond his years. He knew the cameras watched, he understood the whispers, he had been raised under constant public attention. And still he walked with calm confidence. That's why when he cried, the palace shook. Staff who witnessed the moment described it as haunting. George, holding his brother's hand, his voice trembling, simply said, "I thought they were taking him away from us." It wasn't just sadness, it was fear, not the kind born from punishment, but from deep intuitive understanding. He had sensed something wrong long before the adults had, and now it was all boiling to the surface. Senior aides who had been dismissive now sat in emergency review sessions. Internal teams, once protective of Camilla's outreach efforts, began asking hard questions. Even those loyal to her admitted the incident looked terrible. What was meant to be soft influence had turned into emotional collateral, and the youngest future king had felt it all. William and Kate didn't make a public scene, they didn't threaten or lash out. But behind palace walls the dynamic changed instantly. George's breakdown wasn't viewed as weakness. It was seen as clarity, a rare glimpse into just how deeply these children feel the pressure of the crown. And that wrong, vulnerable moment became a turning point, because in George's tears, the Froms saw something terrifying. A child who already understands betrayal. William confronted the palace silently but firmly. After days of silent observation and deep review, Prince William acted not with anger but with precision. He wasn't interested in confrontation, he was interested in accountability. The first thing he did was order a complete audit of his children's access. Every staff member with clearance to interact with George, Charlotte, or Louis was reviewed. Calendars were rechecked. Past visits were re-examined. William was reportedly calm, but cold. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Those closest to him said they had never seen him like that before. He then called a private meeting with palace leadership, one that included the king's chief advisor. William laid out what he and Kate had discovered: the unauthorized invitations, the one-on-one mentoring sessions, the strategic positioning, and most importantly, the effect it had on his children. He didn't name Camilla directly, But he didn't have to. The message was clear: no one under any title or tradition was to influence his children without his or Kate's approval. Shortly after, Camilla, his senior aide, was quietly reassigned. King Charles was informed of everything. While no public statement was issued, a quiet order went out. Camilla, his office, would no longer coordinate with the Wales children on any matter without written clearance. Camilla, sources say, was furious, but restrained. William didn't need a headline. He had reclaimed control. Camilla, his strategy exposed for years. Queen Camilla had worked carefully to shape her role, not just as consort to the king, but as a respected presence across all branches of the royal family. She had cultivated charm, developed alliances, and steered clear of direct scandal. But the Louis incident changed everything. Suddenly attention turned to her pattern of selective affection. Publicly she had praised George and Louis in speeches, calling them brilliant boys with bright futures, but Charlotte, often excluded, sometimes even forgotten in passing remarks. It didn't go unnoticed. Now people were connecting dots behind the scenes. It became apparent that Camilla had long viewed the younger generation as the future of the crown. She now supported, but didn't fully control. Whispers from former aides resurfaced. Some said Camilla had often expressed a desire to guide the heirs in a way Diana never could. She wanted legacy. She wanted history to remember her not as an outsider, but as a matriarch of monarchs. But her methods: carefully tailored access, emotional flattery, isolation under the guise of bonding, no longer looked onerous. They looked strategic. The fact that George sensed did before the adults did only fuel the fire. Camilla, his defenders, pushed back, calling the situation a misunderstanding. But insiders knew better. The strategy was never public. It was quiet, subtle, and now it was completely exposed. Kate's protective response: the moment Kate realized how far things had gone, she stepped in like a storm and did not look back. Calm, measured, and fiercely protective, Kate took immediate control of the children's schedule. From that point forward, no solo invitations could reach George, Charlotte, or Louis without her or William's express approval. No special moments, no mentoring visits, no exceptions. Behind closed doors, she restructured her children's security and support teams. Former aides from her inner circle were brought back in to assist. Every protocol, every appearance, every staff interaction was now carefully filtered. Kate left nothing to chance. Her words, reportedly spoken to her senior staff, were brief but powerful. "We protect them first, always." And she didn't stop there. Kate began rewriting how her children would be introduced to the public. She took back control of their narratives, scheduling joint family appearances, reinforcing sibling unity, and refusing any attempt to divide or individualize their roles for optics. Meanwhile, the palace issued a vague schedule clarification memo suggesting structural changes across all households, but those who knew the real story understood what had happened. Kate had drawn a line, and for the first time in years, the entire palace took a step back, because when Princess Kate rises in defense of her family, nothing stands in her way. Public outrage erupts online. When the story leaked, first as a whisper on royal blogs, then as a headline across social media, it exploded. What began as a quiet palace matter transformed into a full-blown public firestorm. Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram lit up with fury. Hashtags like #PrinceGeorgeProtects, #her hands off Louise and let them be kids began trending globally within hours. Thousands of users, mothers, fathers, teachers, even former royal fans, posted emotional messages of support. One viral tweet read, "When an innocent child has to cry to be heard, something in the system is broken." Camille, his image already fragile in certain circles, collapsed instantly online. She was accused of overreach, manipulation, and exploiting the most vulnerable members of the Old clips were resurfaced, articles were dissected, conspiracy theories flourished, and for once many weren't dismissed. They were taken seriously. Mothers especially rallied behind Kate and George, seeing the story through a lens of maternal protection. Parenting forums exploded in threads about boundaries, favoritism, and emotional manipulation. One user wrote, "George as a child, not a pawn, and Louis isn't a trophy." That post alone received over 500,000 likes. The palace stayed silent, but their silence only poured fuel on the fire. Public opinion polls swung hard. Camilla, his approval rating dipped almost 20% in a week. Meanwhile, George, just a child, was praised as the bravest heart in the House of Windsor. Some dubbed him the boy who protected the crown. Commentators across British morning shows debated what this meant for the monarchy's future. The question was no longer about scandal. It was about structure. The people had spoken, and they had done so loudly, emotionally, and without hesitation. King Charles's quiet disapproval. Inside the palace, the storm didn't just rage, it divided. King Charles was briefed on every detail of the situation, including George's emotional breakdown, Kate's swift intervention, and William's quiet fury. While he remained publicly silent, insiders say the king was deeply unsettled by what he heard behind closed doors. Charles reportedly expressed disappointment, not just at the incident, but at how it unfolded without his knowledge. In one meeting with senior aides, he was overheard saying, "Children are not tools." Not ever. Those words carried weight. Although Charles refused to directly confront Camilla, sources suggest he offered indirect support to William's boundaries. Camilla, his senior team, was quietly rotated. Some appearances were rescheduled indefinitely. No public blame was assigned. But the message was clear: the king would not defend what had happened. Insiders say the relationship between Charles and Camilla grew tense in the days that followed. While Charles still appeared at her side during engagements, their private dynamic had shifted. Trust, already fragile, had been shaken, and although he tried to keep peace between his wife and his son, Charles knew a line had been crossed, not politically, personally. He didn't lash out, but he made it known this must never happen again. The moment that reshaped royal parenting. When the dust began to settle, one truth stood out above all: George's tears had changed the monarchy. The image of a young boy crying for his brother, tears of fear, protection, and wrong awareness, was more than a passing moment. It was a symbol, a warning, a call to protect the next generation from the very system they were born into. William and Kate responded by rewriting the rulebook. From that day forward, their children's access was no longer managed by the palace, it was overseen personally by the parents themselves. Every engagement, every interaction, every planned appearance went through them. Their household, once part of the broader royal machine, became its own